YOBA, what's up and what's happening? And welcome back to It's the YOBA series with me, Chris Hardy. And I'd also like to welcome you back to the Diabetes Transformation course here on It's the YOBA series. So, today, what we're going to be talking about with our diabetes reversal or transformation is we're going to be talking about fats, and we're going to be talking about fats that are within your diet. So, fat is one of three macronutrients. The other two are carbohydrate and also protein. When it comes to fat, there are things that you need to know, there are things that you need to know to avoid, and there's also a little bit of history when it comes to fat, which I'm going to delve into. So, if we go back in time a little bit and we look at post World War II and we go to America, America had obviously just helped win the Second World War, and it was a time of prosperity and a feeling of freedom. Now, within that was a gap with the American public where there was a lot more necessity around food. Food became a lot more widely available, and especially processed foods and processed carbohydrates and also processed fats. So, with these processed foods that are being marketed and manufactured on a mass scale, what's happening to the American public at that time in the 1950s, post World War II, is that they're starting to consume a lot more higher amounts of fructose based foods. Fructose based foods are basically foods that have got sugar inside of them. And alongside that, they're actually starting to consume a lot more manufactured or processed oils. Whereas if we go back in time a little bit further, let's say pre World War One, a lot of people, including people in the United Kingdom, would have been consuming a lot more fat of land, let's say. So they would have been consuming more natural sources of meat. They'd have been consuming more natural sources of fish and dairy, including butter and also including things like lard. All those food groups have got natural sources of fat, and those sources aren't processed, or they're not as highly processed as what the American market was suffering with in the 1950s. So with this newly marketed processed food, it started to create a little bit of a problem for the American public. The processed food, the highly processed sugars and the highly processed oils that they were consuming in marketed products were starting to cause metabolic problems or metabolic disease. And those metabolic diseases were basically things such as diabetes, strokes, and heart attacks started to go on the increase. Other things such as cancer started to increase. And they're all related to, or they all correlate very well to when the American market started to manufacture or mass produce its food. So now America has got a problem, and this becomes so much of a problem that the AHA, the American Heart Association, basically started to look into as to why the public, the general public, were suffering with more things such as strokes, heart attacks, type 2 diabetes, things of that nature. They were becoming a lot more prevalent. So the American Heart Association and the US government started to look into studies as to why their general public were suffering with more metabolic disease. And what they found, amongst other things, is that they found that fat actually may be the problem. Now, with the American Heart Association and looking into fat as possibly the problem as to why Americans are suffering with more metabolic disease, there's a gentleman that's brought into the picture, and his name is Ansel Keys. And Ansel Keys basically had a hypothesis that all fat or fat laden diets, or diets who've got too much fat in, were bad for you. And he was more prophesizing high amounts of carbohydrate, higher amounts of cereals and things of that nature. And so what happened was is that there was a marketing campaign behind this, which was pushed by the American Heart Association and also the US government. So the American public basically are being told but fat itself is actually the problem, is the reason why they're fat, and also that they needed to start to increase the amounts of sugary based snacks, carbohydrate based meals, and also skipping on things such as natural sources of fat and turning to more processed fat or processed oils. Now, the reason that fat was picked on is because Ansel Keys' studies that he looked at with people with high fat diets tended to have poorer amounts of health. However, when you look at the overall general population, fat actually wasn't the real problem. Actually, what the real problem was consuming more highly processed food. One of the things that the American Heart Association could pick up on was the fact that fat in itself per 1 gram has got more calories than protein and carbohydrate. So when you're looking at protein per 1 gram, it has 4 calories. And it's exactly the same for carbohydrate. Per 1 gram, it has 4 calories. But with fat, it has near enough 9 calories per 1 gram. And so the general consensus was, if we knock fat out of the American diet completely and tell the general public that fat is actually bad for us, then we'll lose weight, and all of our metabolic problems and diseases and strokes and heart attacks and diabetes will start to fall back down to a more reasonable level. Now, if we step away from the American Heart Association and also Ansel Keys for just a moment, and let's just go to marketing and food companies. With marketing and food companies, when they're trying to control their margins, fat itself is actually quite an expensive source of macronutrient. It's much, much, much cheaper to use something like a carbohydrate, because a carbohydrate is easier to grow, it's faster to grow, and it's also something that can be produced on a much higher scale. So when the American Heart Association started to look at fat as the problem, that actually coincided with what the food companies and food marketing very much wanted for themselves, for their own products, to be lower in fat, but actually higher in processed fats and processed oils. As decades start to roll on and we start to get up towards the 1980s and the 1990s, what's happening to the Western world is that the individual population, or populations of different countries, should I say, are much, much bigger. Their waist circumference is much larger, and their subcutaneous fat, which is the fat which is stored on the torso and around the thighs and hips and things of that nature, and also the visceral fat, the organ fat, is starting to increase. And the main metabolic problem with visceral fat is that visceral fat is very much linked and does correlate to metabolic problems. So the reason why fat has got such bad press and it's got such a bad name is because it's been marketed that way. Actually, fat itself is not bad for you at all. And here's the reason why. When you look at the other two macronutrients, which are protein and carbohydrate, they actually spike a hormone called insulin. Now, insulin's there for a reason. It's there to help govern food and macronutrients into the body. Okay, so it's a big player in telling where food needs to go when it's being digested. Okay, all those macronutrients. But fat is the only macronutrient that doesn't actually spike your insulin. And if we come back to the 21st century, that's actually where things such as more carnivore-based diets and keto diets have come from, because they're trying to control, and also intermittent fasting, they're basically trying to control the spike in insulin. But when it comes to the macronutrient fat, it is the only macronutrient that doesn't spike insulin, therefore it doesn't store fat the same way, and that's because of the liver. The liver is very much a key player in the reason as to why you're putting on too much weight. And it's not because your liver's faulty or anything like that, far from it. your liver is doing its absolute best to deal with the food that you are consuming. And the food that you're most likely consuming or could be consuming is processed food with higher amounts of calories, higher amounts of processed sugar, higher amounts of salt or sodium, which too much of it is again bad for you, and too much saturated fat, because they're all things that have been processed. So when you're consuming more processed foods, what you need to remember is that your liver is going to most likely convert those processed foods into body fat. And when you're eating from more whole foods, your liver is more likely to govern those whole foods into the right places they need to be. So let's just take fat, for example. Fat will be metabolized and used as energy, whereas if you're having too much carbohydrate, the liver is forced to turn the carbohydrate. If you're having too much carbohydrate in your diet, or if you're having too much processed food in your diet, your liver is forced to convert it into fat, and that conversion is known as de novo lipogenesis. So let's just quickly recap. The body doesn't respond well when it has processed food, and that's basically because it's not the right type of macronutrient for what the body needs, and instead it's more than likely to be processed food is more than likely to be stored as actual fat, either visceral or subcutaneous. Fat has got a bad press, and the reason that is because food marketing companies have marketed their products so well to you that it actually is believed by most people that fat is actually bad for you, when it isn't, as long as it's more natural sources of fat and not sources of highly processed oils. And as I said at the beginning, a lot of processed food that began to be marketed to the Western world started in America, and America was the real first food giant that actually succumbed to marketing and also the belief that fat was bad for the individual. And this is because it was pushed by the AHA, the American Heart Association, and also the US government, and also by people such as Ansel Keys, who pushed more carbohydrate rich diets rather than fat based diets. So we've spoken about fat and where fat started to get a bad press. If you go back in time to pre-agriculture, there would have been nothing such as a manufactured or processed oil. It just wouldn't have happened. To be able to harvest the amount of rapeseed that an individual would need to be able to cook with just wouldn't have been possible. The reason why there are processed oils today is because they are harvested and then they are processed into oil. Now, why is that a problem? Well, the reason that processed oils such as rapeseed oil and seed-based oils, the reason why they're a problem is because they don't heat the same way as things such as butter and lard and olive oil do. The reason is because when you heat a processed oil, it oxidizes, and the oxidization has a negative reaction or a negative effect on the body, and it's something that the body just cannot handle very well. Now, when you're thinking about what is oxidization, well, oxidization, if you can think of a piece of metal, an old piece of metal that you might find outside in your garden or wherever, that metal may well be rusted or have some rust on it. Well, rust is oxidization. It's where the metal has reacted with the oxygen in the atmosphere. And it's the same thing that's happening to your body when you're having these highly processed oils. And basically, it's very corrosive. Whereas when you're consuming more natural fats, such as butter, lard, cheeses, fresh meat, and also things such as olive oil, they have got a higher threshold to temperature, which means that they don't oxidize as much and they're not as corrosive on the body. When you're looking at these oils that have been highly processed, what you must try to remember is that it is a lot cheaper to be able to produce that type of oil and sell it to you, such as things like vegetable oil and rapeseed oil, they're much, much cheaper to be able to produce and mass manufacture than it is to rear cattle or to be able to produce things such as butter. It's a lot more expensive for the manufacturer. Therefore, it puts the price up, and therefore the customer or the consumer may not possibly buy it if it's too expensive. Therefore, what you need to do is you need to make sure that the fat that you do consume is of a more natural, comes from a much more natural source. So, what are the things that I suggest you look out for? Well, first of all, I suggest that you stop buying processed oils straight away. I also suggest that you start to cook with more natural forms of fat or oil. So the fats that I would probably choose would be butter or olive oil, because they're good to cook with and they're also much, much healthier for your body. Also, when you're looking at fats and cooking with fats, another thing that you can factor in is the fat that's found on animal meat or perhaps fish and things like dairy. They have all got natural sources of fat in them, and those types of fats are also fantastic for you. Yes, they've got some saturated fat, but they've also got unsaturated fat. And because it's from a more natural source, it's much, much more healthier for you than something that has been processed and something that just isn't found naturally. And finally, the last thing that I would suggest to you is always think about the food that you're buying and whether it is being processed or not. So if you're talking about cooking with more whole foods, so the foods in their more natural source, one, they're a lot more wholesome and they probably taste a lot better if prepared and cooked properly, but also they're a lot better for your overall problem if you're suffering with high amounts of blood pressure, high blood sugar, perhaps type 2 diabetes, other metabolic related diseases. Those metabolic diseases will start to come down as well as your weight when you start to look at purchasing and eating and consuming more natural whole foods. There is very much a strong correlation, not only to processed foods putting more weight on with more metabolic problems, but there's also another correlation where there are more whole foods being eaten and overall body weight and metabolic problems, metabolic diseases start to come down the other side. So that's what I suggest when you are trying to consume a more healthier diet. So thank you for watching and listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and also comment below and I will get back to you. Reverse your type 2 diabetes. Be fit, be healthy, and of course, be a boss bar.
It's the YOBA series.